Everyone knows the story of the Macintosh, the same way they know the story of David and Goliath. In 1984, a scrappy little computer company took on IBM, the biggest technology corporation on the planet, with a beautiful, friendly little machine that had a smile on its face and a mouse in its hand. The ad ran during the Super Bowl. A woman throws a hammer through a screen of a droning Orwellian dictator. And the tagline promised that 1984 wouldn't be like 1984. It's one of the most celebrated commercials ever made. And then, the story usually says, the Macintosh changed computing forever, and Apple never looked back. Here's what that story skips over entirely. The Macintosh, as originally released, was close to a commercial failure. It nearly took Apple down with it. The man who built it got pushed out of his own company within a year of its release. And Apple spent the next 12 years slowly bleeding out, nearly going bankrupt by the mid-1990s, before finally being saved not by the Macintosh at all, but by buying back the very same man who had been exiled for building it in the first place. The popular myth isn't wrong about the ending. Apple eventually did become the most valuable company on Earth, but it gets the middle of the story almost completely backwards, and understanding what actually happened between 1984 and 1997 tells you something much more interesting than beautiful design beat boring corporate computing. It tells you that Apple's downfall wasn't caused by IBM, and it wasn't caused by Microsoft copying their ideas either, even though that's the second most common version of this myth. Apple's near death was caused by a decision almost identical to the one we've looked at in other companies on this channel. An obsession with controlling every piece of its own ecosystem, made by people who had genuinely good reasons for that obsession, that ended up locking Apple out of the exact growth Microsoft was about to capture instead. To understand how the Macintosh almost killed the company that made it, you have to go back a few years earlier, to the machine that made Apple famous in the first place. In 1977, Apple released the Apple II, and it wasn't the first personal computer ever built, but it was the first one that became a genuine mainstream hit, selling to hobbyists, schools, and eventually small businesses in numbers nobody had really seen before in this category. It made Apple, then a tiny startup run by two guys named Steve, into a real company almost overnight. But 4 years is an eternity in early computing, and by 1981, IBM, the largest and most dominant technology company on the planet, decided the personal computer market was worth entering. When the IBM PC launched, it didn't just compete with the Apple II, it overtook it within months, because IBM had something Apple didn't, an existing reputation with corporate buyers, and a machine that was cheap and functional enough to spread through offices at a scale Apple couldn't match. This was a genuine crisis for Apple, not just embarrassing, but existential. The company that had defined the entire category of the personal computer was suddenly not even the leader in its own category anymore. Steve Jobs, one of Apple's co-founders, became fixated on the idea that Apple needed a genuinely new kind of computer, not an incremental upgrade to the Apple II, something that would leapfrog IBM entirely rather than compete with it head-on. The answer, in Jobs' mind, was something he'd seen a few years earlier on a visit to Xerox's research labs in Palo Alto. Xerox had built an experimental computer called the Alto that used something almost nobody outside of that lab had ever seen: a mouse and a graphical desktop instead of typed commands. It cost the equivalent of a small house, and Xerox never tried to sell it commercially, so almost nobody knew it existed. And Xerox's own leadership, famously, never seemed to grasp what they were sitting on. Jobs saw it during a single visit and became convinced, almost immediately, that this was the future of how ordinary people would use computers, not typing memorized commands into a blinking cursor, but clicking on pictures of the things they wanted to open. That single visit is often treated as one of the most consequential afternoons in the history of computing, and depending on which version of the story you believe, Apple negotiated access to Xerox's research in exchange for stock, rather than simply walking in and copying what they saw, though the popular retelling tends to flatten this into a simpler tale of theft. Apple had actually already started building a computer around this idea, a project called the Lisa. And this is where the Macintosh story really begins, not as its own clean, independent invention, but as a rival, born out of internal conflict. Jobs wanted heavy creative control over how the Lisa was designed, and clashed repeatedly with the Lisa engineering team over cost, design philosophy, and how the machine should be built. Eventually, Apple's leadership sided against him, and Jobs was removed from the Lisa project entirely. Rather than accept that outcome, Jobs did something that would be almost unthinkable inside most companies today. He took over an entirely separate, smaller, dormant project inside the same building, originally started a few years earlier by Apple co-founder Steve Wozniak and an engineer named Jeff Raskin, called the Macintosh, named after Raskin's favorite variety of apple. Jobs recruited his own team away from other Apple projects and set out to build a computer that would beat the very team that had just pushed him out, using many of the same core ideas, the mouse, the graphical desktop, but positioned as cheaper, friendlier, and faster to market than the Lisa. This detail matters more than it might seem, because it tells you something important about the DNA the Macintosh was born with. It wasn't built primarily to beat IBM. It was built, at least in its earliest motivating spark, to beat an internal rival and vindicate one very stubborn, very talented executive who had just been humiliated inside his own company. Everything that follows, the uncompromising design decisions, the refusal to listen to engineers who disagreed with him, the insistence on doing things exactly Jobs' way, traces back to that origin. The Macintosh needed to prove Jobs right, not just prove a new kind of computer was possible. The Lisa launched first, in 1983, at a price of $10,000, and it was a commercial disaster. It was slow, expensive, and most businesses simply couldn't justify the cost. But rather than being a warning sign, the Lisa's failure became, in Jobs' mind, validation, proof that his approach with the Macintosh, cheaper and more consumer-focused, was the correct one all along. Jobs was so confident in what he was building that he went out and personally recruited Pepsi's president, John Sculley, to come run Apple's business side. Sculley had built his career turning Pepsi into a genuine rival to Coca-Cola through aggressive, consumer-focused marketing, and Jobs wanted that same instinct applied to computers, a category still largely sold on spec sheets and technical jargon rather than emotion and lifestyle. Jobs reportedly challenged him with a line about whether he wanted to keep selling sugared water for the rest of his life, or come change the world instead, and Sculley, according to his own later accounts, found the pitch impossible to turn down. That partnership between Jobs' product obsession and Sculley's marketing instincts is what produced the 1984 Super Bowl ad and the carefully engineered launch event where Jobs pulled the Macintosh out of a canvas bag and had it introduce itself in a synthesized voice to a room full of stunned shareholders. It's worth noting, given everything that happens later, just how strange it is that the two men who built this moment together would, within roughly 18 months, be locked in the boardroom fight that ended with one of them gone. It's worth pausing on that demo for a second, because it says something important about the gap between the myth and the reality that follows. The machine on that stage wasn't actually the Macintosh that was shipping to stores. It was a more advanced prototype, running software the actual retail units couldn't handle yet, because the retail Macintosh simply didn't have enough memory to run the speech program smoothly. Apple's leadership understood, even in that celebrated moment, that the real product wasn't quite as capable as what they were showing the world. That gap between the promise and the reality is the thread that runs through everything that happens over the next 2 years. The Macintosh that actually reached customers in 1984 had real substantial problems, and once the initial wave of hype and press coverage faded, those problems started to matter. It ran hot because Jobs had personally insisted the machine ship without an internal cooling fan, wanting it to be silent, a decision his own engineers had pushed back against and lost. It was technically marketed as a modern cutting-edge system, but its internal architecture was a genuine compromise, a processor capable of more than the rest of the machine could actually support, paired with a small amount of memory that limited what it could realistically do. And critically, unlike almost every other personal computer on the market at the time, you couldn't open it up and upgrade it. The memory was soldered directly onto the board. If you wanted more capability, your only option was to buy an entirely new machine. This was a genuinely strange decision for the era, because the entire personal computing culture up to that point had been built around exactly the opposite idea, that a computer was something you customized, expanded, and tinkered with over time. Apple had built its own original fortune on the Apple II, a machine praised specifically for how open and expandable it was. The Macintosh threw that entire philosophy away in favor of a sealed, controlled, take-it-or-leave-it design, a choice that, again, traces directly back to Jobs' instinct for controlling every detail of the finished product, rather than handing any of that control to the people using it. And the software situation compounded the problem. Apple's marketing had leaned heavily on the promise of a rich, capable software library, but the machine actually launched with only 2 programs included, a basic word processor and a simple Paint program. Everything else had to be purchased separately, and the selection available at launch was thin compared to what buyers could get on a Commodore, an IBM-compatible, or even Apple's own aging Apple II. Combine underwhelming software, compromised hardware, no upgrade path, and a price that had been pushed up from Jobs' original vision of under $2,000 to nearly $2,500 to help offset the enormous cost of that Super Bowl campaign, and you get a machine that, once the initial hype cycle wore off, simply wasn't compelling enough for most buyers to choose over cheaper, more flexible alternatives. Sales fell well short of what Apple's leadership had projected, and when a bold, expensive bet doesn't pay off the way its champion promised it would, someone inside the company usually pays the price for that gap between promise and delivery. In this case, it was Jobs himself. Tensions between Jobs and Scully had already been building over pricing, design philosophy, and Jobs' management style, and after a chaotic power struggle throughout 1985, Apple's board sided with Scully. Jobs was stripped of his operational authority and left the company he had co-founded before that year was over. Here's where the popular telling of this story often just stops, treating Jobs' exit as the dramatic climax, and picking back up years later with his triumphant return. But the 12 years in between are the actual center of gravity for understanding why the Macintosh nearly took Apple down with it, and it has almost nothing to do with the specific hardware problems of the original 1984 machine. Those got fixed relatively quickly. Later, Macintosh models added memory upgrades, expansion options, more software support, better cooling. The deeper, more consequential mistake was strategic, and it's the one that actually explains why Apple spent over a decade losing ground it would never fully get back until Jobs returned. While Apple was busy building a closed, tightly controlled machine that only Apple itself manufactured, a completely different company was making the opposite bet, and it's the company most people assume simply beat Apple by copying its ideas. Microsoft had actually been a close software partner of Apple's throughout the early Macintosh years, building some of the applications that shipped alongside the machine. But Microsoft's real strategic advantage had nothing to do with imitation. It came from a decision Apple's leadership made, and kept making for years afterward, to never let anyone else build hardware that ran Apple's operating system. If you wanted a Macintosh, you had to buy it from Apple, full stop, on Apple's hardware, at Apple's price, on Apple's timeline. Microsoft's Windows, running on the graphical interface concept that had, by this point, become an industry-wide ambition rather than Apple's exclusive secret, took the opposite approach entirely. Any computer manufacturer, Compaq, Dell, IBM's own PC division, dozens of smaller companies building cheap IBM-compatible clones, could license Windows and ship it on their own hardware. This meant Windows-compatible machines could be built by intensely competing manufacturers, all racing each other on price and features, while Apple hardware only ever competed against, well, other Apple hardware. By the early 1990s, this dynamic had created an overwhelming numbers advantage for the Windows ecosystem. Software developers, naturally, built their products for whichever platform had the most machines already in people's homes and offices, which meant Windows kept pulling further and further ahead, not because it was fundamentally superior technology, but because Apple's controlled hardware strategy meant it could never match the sheer volume of machines Windows ran on. This wasn't an accident Apple stumbled into. It was, once again, the same instinct that had shaped the original Macintosh. A deep, genuine belief that controlling the entire experience, hardware and software together, produced a better product than the fragmented, inconsistent mess of 100 different manufacturers, all building slightly different machines running the same operating system. And to be fair to Apple's leadership during this period, that belief wasn't crazy. Apple's tightly controlled hardware really did tend to be more reliable and consistent than the wild variants you'd find across the enormous, chaotic universe of Windows-compatible clones. There's a real defensible argument for controlling your own ecosystem. The same argument, ironically, that Apple would eventually be praised for decades later with the iPhone. But in the specific context of the 1980s and 1990s personal computer market, that same instinct meant Apple was voluntarily capping its own market share, while Microsoft's licensing model let Windows spread into every price tier and every manufacturer simultaneously. There actually was a brief moment where Apple's leadership tried to change course, and it's a detail that rarely makes it into the popular version of this story. In the mid-1990s, under CEO Michael Spindler, and continued briefly under his successor Gil Amelio, Apple experimented with licensing the Mac operating system to a small number of outside manufacturers, companies like Power Computing and Radius, that built what were called Mac clones, machines running genuine Apple software but built by other companies entirely, similar in spirit to how Windows had always worked. For a moment, it looked like Apple might be correcting the exact mistake that had let Windows pull so far ahead, and some of these clone makers even managed to undercut Apple's own hardware on price while still running the same operating system, exactly the kind of competitive pressure Windows manufacturers had been generating against each other for over a decade. But the clone program was poorly managed from the start. Licensing terms undercut Apple's own hardware margins without generating enough additional software ecosystem growth to offset the losses. Some clone makers began cutting directly into sales of Apple's own higher-margin computers rather than expanding the overall Macintosh market. And Apple's leadership, watching its own hardware division suffer, grew increasingly resentful of a program it had approved only reluctantly in the first place. When Jobs eventually returned to the company in 1997, one of his very first moves was to cancel the Mac clone licensing program entirely and pull that control back in-house, buying out at least one of the licensees directly to shut the arrangement down for good. The lesson Apple's leadership took from this brief experiment wasn't, "We should have started licensing years earlier and executed it properly, the way Microsoft did from the very beginning." It was, "Licensing our platform is a mistake, full stop. reinforcing the exact same control-first instinct that had shaped the original Macintosh over a decade earlier, just at a moment when the company badly needed the opposite lesson. Throughout this same period, Apple's own product lineup became a genuine mess, another symptom of an organization that had lost the singular focus Jobs had once forced onto every decision, however maddening that focus had been to work under. By the mid-1990s, Apple was selling dozens of nearly indistinguishable Macintosh models across confusingly overlapping product lines: Performer, Quadra, Centris, LC, each with slightly different specifications aimed at slightly different retail channels, to the point where even loyal Apple customers struggled to understand which model was actually meant for them. A customer walking into a store in 1995 might find 3 or 4 different machines with nearly identical processors and nearly identical prices, differentiated mainly by which retail chain happened to carry which model number, a level of internal confusion that made it genuinely difficult for Apple's own sales staff to explain why a shopper should choose one over another. This wasn't a company executing a clear, differentiated strategy against Windows. It was a company that had lost its center, throwing variations at the wall because nobody at the top had the authority or the conviction to say no to any of them, the exact discipline that a decade earlier had been Jobs' defining, if occasionally infuriating, trait. By 1996, the consequences of over a decade of this drift had become impossible to ignore. Apple's market share had shrunk to a small single-digit percentage of the overall personal computer market, a staggering fall for the company that had essentially invented the category 2 decades earlier. The company posted a loss of over $700 million in a single fiscal year, and analysts and journalists were openly speculating that Apple might not survive as an independent company much longer, that it would either be acquired by a larger rival or simply run out of cash and disappear entirely, joining a long list of once dominant computing companies that had already faded into irrelevance during this same stretch of years. Michael Dell, founder of the rival PC maker that bore his name, was famously asked what he would do if he were running Apple, and said he'd shut the company down and give the money back to shareholders, a comment that, at the time, read less like a hot take and more like the honest consensus of most of the industry. That's how dire the outside perception of Apple's future had become, less than 15 years after the Macintosh had been unveiled as the machine that was supposedly going to change the world. Apple's leadership, staring down that collapse, made a decision that, in hindsight, is one of the strangest and most consequential in corporate history. They went looking for new operating system technology to modernize the aging Macintosh software, and the leading candidate they eventually settled on was built by a company called Next. Next had been founded over a decade earlier by the same Steve Jobs that Apple's board had pushed out in 1985. After leaving Apple, Jobs had built Next to make advanced workstation computers aimed at universities and research institutions rather than everyday consumers, an attempt, in a sense, to build the sophisticated, uncompromising machine he'd always wanted to build without a board second-guessing him. Next's actual computer hardware never sold particularly well. Expensive, elegant, black cube-shaped machines that impressed reviewers far more than they impressed corporate purchasing departments, and the hardware business was eventually shut down entirely. But the operating system underneath it, called Next Step, was widely respected as genuinely advanced, elegant software, years ahead of what most of the industry was shipping, built on the kind of modern architecture the aging Macintosh operating system, still carrying design decisions from the mid-1980s, badly needed. In parallel, Jobs had also personally purchased a small computer graphics division from filmmaker George Lucas for roughly $10 million, renamed it Pixar, and spent the following decade pouring his own money into it, while it slowly built the technology and talent behind computer-animated filmmaking, releasing Toy Story, the first entirely computer-animated feature film, in November 1995, just over a year before Apple came calling. It's a strange footnote in this story that the same stretch of years Apple spent nearly collapsing under the weight of its own indecision was, for the man it had exiled, one of the most creatively and financially significant decades of his life. An entire second career's worth of vindication happening almost entirely outside of Apple's orbit, quietly building the credibility and financial independence that would matter enormously once Apple came asking for help. In December 1996, Apple's leadership, desperate for a technological foundation to rebuild the company's failing operating system, agreed to acquire Next for over $400 million, primarily to obtain the Next Step software. As part of that deal, Steve Jobs returned to Apple as an advisor, and within a matter of months, in a boardroom reversal almost nobody could have predicted a decade earlier, he had maneuvered his way back into the CEO role, ousting the same leadership structure that had, in various forms, run the company since his original exit. This is the part of the story that the popular myth gets closest to right, but even here, it tends to oversimplify what actually happened. Jobs' return isn't just a feel-good redemption arc. It's the moment the exact same control-obsessed instinct that had caused Apple's original wounds, no fan in the Macintosh, no upgradability, no clone licensing, got redirected into finally building a genuinely coherent, unified strategy instead of a fragmented, indecisive one. Jobs' first moves back at Apple were brutal and decisive in a way the company hadn't seen in over a decade. He killed the confusing, overlapping product lineup almost entirely, famously reducing Apple's entire product strategy down to a simple grid, a consumer machine, and a professional machine in both desktop and portable form. 4 products total, replacing dozens. He killed the Mac clone licensing program, and he directed the development of a new operating system, built on the Next Step foundation Apple had just acquired, that would eventually become Mac OS X, the software lineage that still powers every Mac sold today. The iMac, released in 1998, was the first visible symbol of this new, focused Apple, a colorful, simplified all-in-one computer built around the exact philosophy the original Macintosh had promised back in 1984, but never fully delivered on, something genuinely easy enough for anyone to use, priced and built well enough to actually deliver on that promise this time. It sold well beyond what most analysts expected for a company that, less than 2 years earlier, had been openly discussed as a candidate for total collapse. So here's what everyone actually gets wrong about this story. It's not that IBM crushed the Macintosh with corporate muscle and the Mac heroically rose from the ashes. It's not even that Microsoft simply copied Apple's ideas and won, through imitation and unfair tactics. A version of this story Apple's own leadership has, at times over the decades, been happy to encourage. The real story is that Apple built the Macintosh out of an internal power struggle, launched it with real, substantial flaws that its own leadership understood, and tried to paper over, even during the celebrated launch demo itself, and then, for over a decade afterward, kept making the same underlying strategic choice: tight, singular control over both hardware and software. That had shaped the original machine, without ever fully reckoning with the fact that this exact choice was the reason Microsoft's more open, more chaotic, more widely distributed approach was quietly winning the actual war for market share the entire time. And when Apple briefly tried to correct course with the clone licensing experiment in the mid-1990s, the attempt was executed poorly enough that it reinforced the opposite lesson, doubling down on control rather than opening up further, right up until the company was staring down potential collapse, and had no choice left but to bring back the one person stubborn and controlling enough to finally make that instinct work, by applying it with ruthless focus instead of scattered indecision. The lesson underneath all of this isn't really about computers. And it isn't really even about control versus openness in the abstract, because both strategies can genuinely work depending on execution. Apple's obsession with controlling its own ecosystem is the exact same instinct that, decades later, would help build the iPhone into one of the most valuable products in the history of commerce, a closed, tightly controlled platform that Apple still refuses to license out to other manufacturers to this day, and one that has made the company trillions of dollars in the process. The difference wasn't the instinct itself. The difference was execution, timing, and whether the company still had the discipline to say no to distractions and half measures along the way. In 1984, that same controlling instinct, applied with genuine conviction but poor discipline around cost and compatibility, produced a flawed, underpowered machine wrapped in brilliant marketing. In the mid-1990s, a half-hearted, poorly executed attempt to loosen that control produced a licensing mess that reinforced exactly the wrong lesson at exactly the wrong moment. And in 1997, the same instinct, finally applied with total focus and the willingness to kill nearly everything that didn't fit the vision, saved the company entirely and set the template for everything Apple has built since. A strategy isn't good or bad in isolation. It's good or bad depending on whether the people running it have the discipline to execute it fully, and the humility to notice when the specific conditions around them have changed enough that yesterday's winning formula needs to be applied differently today. Apple nearly died from a version of the exact same instinct that would go on to make it the most valuable company in the world, not because the instinct was wrong, but because for over a decade, almost nobody at the top had the discipline or the conviction to execute it properly, until the one person too stubborn to let go of it finally got a second chance to prove he'd been right all along. If you want more of these, the stories where the popular explanation everyone repeats turns out to be hiding the actual, more interesting reason something happened, let me know in the comments which one you want next. I read every single one, and they genuinely decide what gets made around here. See you in the next video.